Good evening to all. As the Queen's representative in Nova Scotia, it is my pleasure to welcome you to the final Evenings at Government House event for the Winter 2022 series. À titre de représentant de la Reine en Nouvelle-Écosse, je suis très heureux de vous accueillir à la dernière soirée, dans le cadre des soirées à la résidence du gouverneur de la saison d'hiver 2022. Patsy and I have been delighted to welcome guests to in-person and online performances this season. Regardless of the location or event format, it has been an honor to gather with each of you over the past several months. We appreciate your ongoing support of the culture, history, and heritage of our province and our nation. Tonight, we have put together a special virtual presentation for your enjoyment. Composer and pianist Garrett Krause will discuss his vision as a musician and how he uses music to connect with audiences. He will also present several pieces that he composed to demonstrate his creative process. Mr. Krause is an artist who represents the future of composition in Canada. He has won numerous awards from organizations at the provincial and national level, including the Canadian Conservatory and the Canadian Chamber Choir, for his work. Recently, he composed a piece entitled "Where Pines and Maples Grow," performed by the PEI Symphony Orchestra. When asked to describe the inspiration behind the piece, Mr. Krause said, "The serene maple in a forest of many trees does not desire to be the tallest, loudest, or most imposing, but is singular in its content, gentle and radiant glow. The maple is all Canadians." It is wonderful to see an emerging artist such as Mr. Krause share his gifts with Atlantic Canada and the country. I look forward to following his journey as a composer and a musician. To conclude, Patsy and I are very much looking forward to this evening's presentation. We thank you for your interest in the Evenings at Government House series. Je termine en disant que Patsy et moi avons très hâte d'entendre l'exposé de ce soir. Nous vous remercions de votre intérêt pour la série des soirées à la résidence du gouverneur. Thank you. Merci. Willow.
Good evening, guests and friends. On behalf of their honors, it is my pleasure to welcome you to a special encore presentation of Evenings at Government House. My name is Melissa Gertson, and I'm the Communications Advisor to the Lieutenant Governor. Tonight, I am pleased to introduce composer and pianist Garrett Krause. Mr. Krause's compositions have been described as offering moving imagery and rewarding musical challenges. He has published work with Cypress Choral Music as part of the Canadian Chamber Choir Series for accomplished choirs. His work has been performed by various orchestras and choirs in Atlantic Canada and Alberta. In 2017, Mr. Krause won the Canadian Chamber Choir's Canada 150 Composition Competition. As a pianist, he performs at festivals and accompanies other performers. Mr. Krause has used his talents to give back to the community. He provides training opportunities to students and has won awards from the Alberta Registered Music Teachers Association and the Alberta Piano Teachers Association. I hope you enjoyed tonight's presentation. Thank you again for your interest in Evenings at Government House.
Hi, my name is Garrett Krause. I'm a composer, musician, and music educator. I've written music for large ensembles, for orchestra, as well as smaller groups and solo instruments. And I also enjoy writing for choirs and vocal groups as well. More recently, I've gotten into newer forms of media, such as podcast music and film and TV scoring. Music has always been a big part of my life, even since my earliest childhood memories. When I was quite young, my parents enrolled me in something called Kadai music training, which is a music education system based around singing. So from that, I transitioned into singing in choirs all through growing up. And then outside that, I can just remember listening to a lot of music and loving it. We had a big collection of cassette tapes of all different kinds of music, and I would always be listening to something. I can particularly remember being drawn to the more classical instrumental side of music as opposed to pop and rock, but I really just was obsessed with all of it. Yeah, a lot of my fondest childhood memories involve music in some way. Even from then, this strong interest in music began to define some of the life choices that I made. So in junior high, my family got a piano for the first time, and I switched from singing in a choir to taking piano lessons. And I can just remember being obsessed. Like, I would play hours and hours a day, all sorts of music, not necessarily the music that I should have been practicing for my lessons, but I just played whatever I could get my hands on. And at the same time, I think I started making up my own music. I wouldn't have thought of it as composing or anything like that at the time. It was just sort of playing around and improvising. And then at some point, I got a new teacher who had, as part of her music studio, she required all of her students to write their own pieces. And we'd have a little concert and all play our pieces for each other. And this was a defining moment in my life, I think, because I had always been interested in composing, but I thought it was something that only a select few geniuses could actually do. And so when I suddenly had an invitation and permission to write music, that was a really important moment. So that probably would have been the first time I officially composed and wrote down a piece of music. My teacher encouraged me to submit some pieces that I'd written in composition competitions, and I had some early success and won some of those, and that really got me hooked. It wasn't always an easy process, I would say, but I really loved the challenge of it. So I continued studying composition in university, as well as continuing my piano lessons to a point where I was teaching as well, and began doing some accompanying work and playing for choirs. And that sort of really felt full circle in a certain way. I had such fond memories of being in a choir as a kid, and now I get to continue in that and use my talents that I have as a piano player to be a part of these groups that form such a great sense of community as well. as my interest and knowledge about music grew, I found myself drawn to the composers as opposed to the way some people are drawn to performers. I was interested in the people and the process that had actually created this music. One of the big hurdles for me starting to write music was the sort of popular culture idea that composers are singular geniuses. There's all these stories of someone like Mozart composing an entire symphony in his head, and the only constraint was writing it down on paper. And that idea is really intimidating for someone who just feels like a normal mortal. And so it took, like I said earlier, it took this invitation and permission from a teacher to start writing music that then I got into it and realized it was less, at least for me, less a process of, music being dictated from the gods and more akin to something like sculpture, where it was a process of chiseling into the marble, a process of discovering the music. And I fell in love with that process. My vision as a composer has tended to take on certain characteristics. I find myself drawn a lot to other forms of art as inspiration. So for example, I definitely am very inspired by visuals. So I have a lot of pieces that are inspired by landscapes or story elements or emotional elements in poetry, and that may lead to a choral piece, or it may just be something orchestral. The challenge and journey of writing that music then becomes, how do I translate that piece of inspiration into my musical language and hope to convey that then to the audience so they can feel what I'm feeling when I'm inspired. The journey of writing a piece is still a little bit mysterious and sometimes magical, and usually not that linear. But I've developed a process that helps guide me along that journey, and it usually starts with finding a source of inspiration, or at least constraining myself in some way. It's actually really helpful as an artist, and this is not always intuitive, but it's helpful to have more constraints. And sometimes that is something like getting a commission to write a piece of music for a specific religious festival or a specific themed event, or to write music for based on specific poetry or something like that. And that can actually really help the starting place. And so from there, once I have some constraints in place, then my mind can begin to wander on either different musical ideas or even more broadly to find the poetry for a choir piece. And the more I can narrow it down in that very beginning stage, I've found that leads to more success as I continue writing the piece. From there, once I have some ideas and some constraints in place, I can begin with the actual musical components. And I have a process that I learned from some of my university teachers, and that involves a idea generation phase at the beginning. And So that may be either taking pieces of paper or a software on the computer, and I'll just begin to improvise and make up different ideas that I think could form a part of this piece or that sound like what I'm going for. And I try and get away from any sort of critical thought at this point, and it's usually just getting down as many ideas as possible. So for instance, when I'm writing out things, I have a little binder here that just has little sheets of music, and here I have some older ones, and it may be just a little written idea or it may be actual notes, but it's just trying to get an idea out. And usually it's I stick to one idea on a page, and I'll write out that idea, and it may just be a few notes or some words or some chords, and then from that I just flip over the next page and start another idea. The idea being just to get out as much as possible and to get away from already picking apart every idea before it even has a chance to grow into something. The next stage is then a idea exploration phase. And that involves taking some of these ideas and taking them and exploring all of the musical possibilities of that. And usually that's involved starting a new page. And so from there, you may take the three notes or the chord or whatever it may be and just explore all of the possible expansions of that. So using that idea as a little kernel, what further ideas can come from it. So it may be something like flipping it upside down or backwards, or turning a melody all at the same time into a chord, just exploring all of the different possible variations of that. And one of the great side effects of this process is that there are plenty of pieces of classical music or other music that when you analyze them, something that you thought was unrelated, like a bass line and a melody, when you analyze them, you realize that they're actually the same thing, or they're born from the same idea, and they may be, flipped around or whatever it may be. And a lot of people look at that and sort of their head explodes, and it's really cool. But this is my little secret, I guess, that I'm going to pass on here, is that when you take an idea and at the beginning stage do all this sort of exploration of it, then that gives you material for further, when you're deeper into the writing process of it, you have all this material that you can pull from that is born from the same seed. And I think it also really helps with cohesiveness within a piece when you have a smaller amount of ideas that then are used as material to form most of the majority of the piece. Then the last phase of this is then really trying to write out the piece. And this is where the experience and the craft that I've developed and the training that I've had really comes into play. And I think it's a mistake to just try and start at the beginning and write out the piece. Usually the process is more like having one of the ideas that I came up with and really knowing where I want that to fit in the piece, and starting with there and trying to slot all those things together that I know are definitive moments, and then trying to work out the other stuff. And it's a really cool, exciting process sometimes. Sometimes I'll struggle with a little section and not know what to do with it, and then decide to move on and be writing something later, and I'll come up with this new idea that will be the key to unlocking that earlier section that I was struggling with. And so after that, the long hours put into that, then at the end I'll come out with a piece. And it's really exciting because most of the time it will not be what I expected I was going to write when I jumped into the process. A bit of a more concrete example of this. I'm going to play a condensed excerpt of an orchestral piece that I've written called Where Pines and Maples Grow. So this piece was written for the PEI Symphony Orchestra for an event that celebrated the 150th anniversary of the Charlottetown Conference. And they specifically wanted the piece to incorporate a bunch of different Canadian folk songs or familiar elements, and then also incorporate O Canada. And so when I was planning out this piece for the opening, in my idea, I took just the first four notes of O Canada that we're all familiar with, da 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 da. And in my exploration of that, I sort of liked what it sounded like flipped upside down. So I built an opening to the piece, sort of structured around this sort of upside down version of it, and then exploring that through different rhythms and different orchestral combinations and emphasis on different notes, building that up, and then that leads to the familiar right side up version of the O Canada opening motif. I've laid it over just with some footage of landscapes because that was a source of inspiration for this piece. I know I talked to an American conductor once who said that one of the trends that he noticed that defined Canadian music was a real strong connection to the land and landscapes. And that definitely was a part of this piece. One characteristic that I think defines a good composer and well-written music is when the music is suited and idiomatic for the different instruments that are being used. So in the case of voice, the voice has its own unique challenges. Some of those are that singers need to breathe, and others are things like certain vowel sounds can sound much better in different registers of the voice, or can be difficult in different registers of the voice. Then on top of that, the voice is kind of unique in that outside of people who have perfect pitch, a lot of people can't just pick a random note on the page out of thin air. So you have to find a way to lead the singers to the pitch that they're going to arrive to, rather than just forcing them to pull a random note out of the air. Then setting a text to music just involves a lot of time spent studying the words and the poetic form, and deciding if there are any unique things in, for example, the poetic structure that you might want to emphasize by having repetitions of music, or having different sections in the music that correspond with different sections of the text. That's sort of the bigger picture. And then when you zoom in, it becomes deciding what will make up the different phrases, and if there's any parts of the text you want to repeat. And then zooming in even further, there's the different stresses and rhythm of, say, for example, the English language that you want to follow. It can be extremely difficult for a singer to have the rhythms and natural stresses of a word not line up with the musical rhythms and the musical meter. Deciding how that maps out onto music is a big step in writing vocal music. So this next piece that I'm going to present that I've written is called The Maple, and it's based on a text by Charles G.D. Roberts. This was written for the Canadian Chamber Choir. And you'll notice, for example, that I tried to draw parallels between the text in the opening and near the end by repeating some of the music, but adapting it to fit the different stresses of the text of the last section. I really tried to evoke some of the emotions and some of the scenery that was described in the text. as I mentioned earlier, there can be a lot of liberation and creativity in constraints. So one form of media that I've always loved, but I've only began exploring recently in writing is music for film and TV scoring. And this has its own unique set of challenges in that you may have a scene that has 30 seconds of action music, and then at second 31, it has to cut away and naturally transition into music that's more emotional, for example. And this becomes a fun challenge when presented with this framework of writing music that naturally follows the ebbs and flows of the editing of the scene. I think right now is an interesting moment in the classical music field in particular, in that a lot of the expected paradigm of who comes to orchestra concerts, for example, and what kind of music is played there is really being shifted. It's been a little scary for some groups, but it's also created this exciting space where there's now a lot of new voices that didn't have a chance to shine before that are now being listened to and explored. And there's also new forms of music that are being given a chance. So I talked about film scoring, for example, earlier, and it's something that was sort of not recognized in the classical field as legitimate music, even though I really disagree, because there's a direct lineage from a lot of the great classical composers to the early composers of Hollywood and then to their proteges that came after. And so more recently, there's been concerts that the orchestras play this music live to a projection of the picture. And it's challenging music, and I think it's drawing new audiences to orchestral concerts. And then on top of that, I think there's a lot of musicians who are finding exciting new creative ways to reach broader audiences. And there's been such an interesting wave, especially during the pandemic when people were locked down and they were using online media suddenly and in new ways. I've seen a lot of exciting creativity coming out of the constraints of some of the new platforms. There is a new musical being worked on Broadway that is built from TikTok videos. YouTube and SoundCloud, and ever increasing access to really good music software and educational videos about music on YouTube has really done a great job of equalizing who has had access to musical knowledge and then also who has had the ability to just create their own music and share it online with everyone. Part of the reason that I'm passionate about music education is that I think it is part of the reason that the classical music world is shrinking a little bit. And by that, I mean there used to just be a general base of musical knowledge that was expected as a given from the general population, and I don't think that that's there. And by that, I mean something like just the knowledge of what a symphony is as a musical form or a fugue. Forms like that were maybe taught in school, but also when classical music was a little bit more widespread, it was just that knowledge was in society a bit more. And the lack of that knowledge can be a bit intimidating to people who may be interested in this kind of music, but they don't know exactly how an orchestra works, or they don't know how these form works. And even for myself, I can remember when I learned some of those things, it was really exciting. The music sounded great before, but once I understood a little bit more of what was going on in the music and how I could see how someone like Mozart might write a symphony in a certain way and someone like Beethoven might write it in a different way, and be able to appreciate how these people were playing in the same sandbox but doing very different things, that just opened up a new appreciation for me. So I'm passionate about spreading some of this knowledge that's become a little bit cloistered away in academia or for people who can afford music lessons. I'm passionate about spreading that kind of knowledge, and also the things that I've learned as a composer, or how composers work, to tear down that idea of the composer as a singular genius and really spread the idea of how anyone can compose, and how to give people a little, to start their training and give them some skills in that area. I'd really like to spread that knowledge. I'm also a big proponent of music education and access to music for everyone, because of just the joy and the community that I know that it brings to people. We live more and more in a society that's become quite atomized, especially with things like the pandemic. And there's a lot of these institutions that really brought people together, for example, communities or churches, and a lot of these, their importance has dwindled in society. And I think something like music is open to everyone, and it really does build a great sense of unity. I mentioned before how, as I was growing up, being in choirs really brought a lot of my fondest memories and created lifelong bonds with different people. And I want to be a part of opening that experience to everyone. I can't talk about my career as a musician and a composer without giving a huge thanks to my teachers, and then the people who have supported me along the way, which has just been invaluable. The people who have commissioned me to write new music, or performed music that I've written, or given me opportunities to talk about and present my music, such as this presentation. So I want to give a huge thanks to those people, and for those of you who have tuned in and watched this.